Well, once again, thank you for joining us. We're on video 12 of our series, Seriously, which is just going through the book by Skye Jethani. By Skye Jethani, called What If Jesus Was Serious? And we're just looking at the Sermon on the Mount, and we're just kind of looking over chapters 55, 56, 57. And this is actually in the book, if you're reading along with us, this is the start of part 8, which we're kind of coming into the end of chapter 7 of Matthew, which is coming to the close of the Sermon on the Mount. And so I think it's really important to sort of, when we just start here with Skye brings up, is really kind of more of an overview of the end of Matthew chapter 7. And basically, and we're seeing throughout this whole chapter, the rest of this chapter, multiple calls to obedience when it comes to, here's the path and the gates. Here's one you should go down. Here's one you shouldn't go down. Warning to those who just merely appear obedient. Foolish and wise builders. And so basically the idea is all that Jesus has been talking about, it's not about simply, oh, that's a good teaching.
Yep.
It's just like some sort of theoretical encouragement of how to live this out. Or for us to say, just nod our heads or be impressed by, or we are entertained. What a great speaker. It was so good. Or just like, oh, that was great information to make ourselves feel like we know more.
Or sometimes I think today people look at the Sermon on the Mount and say, well, that was good for people back then, or people would get eaten alive today if they tried to live that way.
That's right.
Or something like that, where they don't necessarily disagree with it in principle, but they have no intention or don't think it's practical to live it out in any way.
Well, I think it's the idea that we got to look at this more than just especially our whole belief system it's not a confessional belief system so much, and we can get stuck there. It really is a lived out belief system.
And that isn't always how Christianity comes across.
No.
We're very much trying to lead people to a confession of, being a follower of Jesus. And not that that's wrong and it's valid, but really it's just the beginning point.
Absolutely.
There has to be a life change. There has to be transformation. And that leads to a change in behavior.
Well, and we do sometimes give a lot of praise and give a lot of notoriety to those who can communicate it well, articulate all the kind of the right things, but realistically fail when it comes to a practical, lived out faith.
Do what I say and not do as I do.
Yeah, and this is really the idea of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Where you become more enamored with the teaching than whatever the next step of actual obedience is.
And that's exactly what we think of people who say one thing and do another.
Yep. And so I think we see that Jesus has been prepping this. The idea of the Lord's Prayer says, your will be done. To pray it. We're supposed to pray it. We're supposed to learn it. We're supposed to then live it.
Yeah.
And it seems that Jesus is anticipating that, and he won't.
Yeah, and I think it's implied when Jesus says, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, is that your will be done by me through my interactions with people and my actions here on earth will bring your will done on here as it is in heaven.
Yeah, that's right. And so we started with Matthew 7, and I'm just going to read verse 13 to 14. It says, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only few find it.
So Jesus is definitely anticipating that many will not.
Yes, exactly. In a lot of ways, Skye brings this up when he's talking about this, is that there's the unpopular narrow way, which is not the best way to market something.
Yeah. Go this way, but it's going to be really hard and difficult.
That's
and
right.
not many people will join you.
That's right. It's just like, this is the right way.
Yeah.
But like the crowd isn't going that way. It's not really, it's not appealing necessarily. And I think based on what Jesus has talked about throughout the Sermon on the Mount is that, as well as many other places, is that the narrow road is the road that rejects the idea of, we'll say, selfish motives.
Yep.
The idea of growing our own personal influence, the way the religious leaders were portraying themselves and praying, the idea of prestige and power, and that the narrow road is actually full of servanthood and love.
Yeah.
And I think about that as when James and John, two of Jesus' disciples, were like, hey, can we, when it comes to glory, when it comes to heaven, can we sit on your right and left side? And essentially breaks down his response in Mark 10 to them is, it said, whoever wants to become great among you must be a servant. And whoever wants to be the first must be a slave of all. It's not really enticing. That seems a little narrow road there.
Yeah.
For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So it's the idea of giving up the idea of being powerful, influential, and to be a servant. The idea of accumulating power to really empowerment.
And I don't think much has changed today. All of us are looking to get ahead. All of us want to be in control. All of us want to attain power over somebody or some circumstances. Yeah. So I think we can certainly relate to that idea where Jesus says, not so with you.
Yeah. And I think it's just like, it's also it's normal. I don't, maybe that's the right one to say. I basically say, don't beat yourself up. I think it's very normal to want some sort of influence. Like it's normal to do that. It's some people want it to greater degrees than others and all that. And it's the idea of like, that means it's a popular road. It's obviously the thing that a lot of people want to go to some degree or other. And he's saying, well, but I'd like you to go down this road of love and really defining love is that it was servant.
Yep. Putting others' needs ahead of your own.
Yeah. Scott McKnight writes the gate is narrow because it requires a person to turn from sin, or I think another way to say it is selfishness.
Yep.
To follow Jesus, to do the will of God as taught by Jesus. He goes on to say, in essence, the narrow gate is to follow Jesus by learning to live by the Jesus creed, which is love God, love others, and the golden rule, which we talked about in the last video, which is treat others in a way that you would like to be treated. And so, if to truly take Jesus serious, the things we might do are going to be difficult, which is the premise of the book, What If Jesus Was Serious?
Yeah, and I think that's really what no one really wants to be, or your first impulse wouldn't be to be a servant or to put others' needs ahead of your own. We're all, I would say, pretty selfish. At least we have a self-preservation instinct. Yep. So I know what I try to do when I come across those situations is to try and find a loophole. I will do it, but and the Pharisees were experts at this, and Jesus was always calling them out on that. And so I think to not do that, we need to find ways to not try and get around what Jesus said or trying to explain it away like, oh, that was good for them back then, but not today.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really easy to do. I mean, you go back to the intro of What If Jesus Was Serious? His sort of setup for that was, having a class teaching this and people's response to that, to the Sermon on the Mount when he questioned them, the seriousness of living this way. And they're like, well, that's impossible. We can't do that.
Yeah.
And I think that's the idea of, like, again, the popular road is possibly to say, like, oh, you know what, that's really hard. That'd be difficult. I don't think I could do that. And so I just won't. And so I think that's where he's getting at. And I mean, and then let's just be honest. We've talked about this a couple times through this. He talks about enemy love in this. That is not the popular road, because it's not an easy path to walk on. It's much easier to blast people on social media. Rather than to safely engage them somewhere. It's easier to vilify or to create sides, and there's something I think we kind of get out of it to be able to do that. Some sort of high, or so, what do you want to say that was, that to vilify and things like that. And
I know we talked about it in the last video, but I think it's worth talking about for another minute here is like, who is my enemy?
Yeah. That is good, and I think a good way that I've come to is that sometimes it's people we be okay to see something not so great happen to, people that we just find difficult.
We all have those in our lives.
I really like. I was reading a book by Dan White Jr. called Love over fear. And he talks about receiving an email from someone who is saying some rather harsh things and also saying those things to people and around and all that. And he talks about his instinctive reaction was to attack him.
Yep.
Send that email back and just tell him things he really needed to hear, how terrible he was and all that sort of stuff. Instead, after some time, he decided he was going to go to this person's house, and he brought muffins, asked if it was okay to talk, and the guy said that. And in the conversation, they talked about a lot of things that, they shared in common, life things, kids, all that. And then they got to sort of the issues.
The email. Yeah.
And really at the end of the day, he said, we solved some things. We still had some differences. Mm-hmm. But there was some sort of love that was experienced in that moment. It was a narrow road. It was very difficult. He talks about being, to hear some of the things he had to say and to hear, again, back and forth.
But I think it's really important what he did, though. He didn't respond with an email or even a phone call. He went to the guy's place, or he met with him in person where he could look him in the eye.
Yeah.
And we were talking about emotional sensitivity and self-awareness in the last video, where you don't have that in an email. I can't look in your face and say, I wouldn't necessarily understand even that I've hurt you. I think sometimes people say things on the internet thinking that, I'm expressing myself and I want to get my point across, and I don't care. I don't think we even think about who it hurts.
Yeah. I think it's sometimes really also easy over what it is, social media, all that, to not really see them as a real person.
Yeah.
The fact that when he talks a story, they talked about their kids. It's like, oh, this is a father. There's some realness to this, and to realize,
and something they both could relate to
and share. And I think that's sometimes easy to do. And that's why I think we vilify people. We can we create a character, and as opposed to multifaceted people like we all are. So and again, going back to the idea of the golden rule, we treat others as we want to be treated, especially those who we struggle with.
Mm-hmm. Which is hard. And I think that's where, and Jesus promised that he would send his Spirit, thankfully, to help us with that, to be able to live a transformed life, is that we can't really do it all by ourselves.
That's right. And I really think it's important. This narrow road isn't about perfection.
Yep.
It is about humility. It is about, we walk a road, we're going to make some mistakes. We learn from those mistakes. We grow from those, and we just keep following Jesus.
Following Jesus, yeah.
And I think it's really, this is the point, I think, in the book that really I've never looked at this way. I just saw the narrow road, or the wide road, and one leads to destruction and one leads to life. But I really like how Skye Jethani sort of builds it in the idea of, even though this might be an unpopular road, it's not a lonely one.
And that's, I think, a really common misconception.
I think so.
We think the narrow road, because it's a narrow, is a lonely one.
Yeah, and I think
I'm walking it all by myself. No one's in front of me. No one's behind me. No one's beside me. I just got to keep on trudging, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think I really appreciated that because, the idea of narrow very much had me alone, more so than as, one thing that Skye talks about is Jesus calling us into a community. So though it's narrow, there's a community in there. And it is the road that where we encounter the presence of Jesus. And I think that's the other thing that we need to see is it's we're not alone on those two things. One, there is a community in there. Mm-hmm. There is a community that is choosing to walk that road, and Jesus is found on that road.
And I think we mentioned this in the last video too, is that we help each other.
Yeah.
And oftentimes God answers our prayers through those other same people. So I think that's extremely important to recognize that we're not alone, and that Jesus, as he promised, will always be with us as well.
Yeah. That's why I really like the ending of this chapter, chapter 57. The leaves with the quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Mm-hmm. And this is somebody who definitely, if you read his life, there was some narrow road choosing there. I mean, that making choices that imprisoned him, that he saw execution because of these choices.
Yeah.
He says, as long as I recognize this road as the one I am commanded to walk, and I try to walk it in fear of myself, it is truly impossible. But if I see Jesus Christ walking ahead of me, step by step, If I look only at him and follow him step by step, then I will be protected on this path.
That's powerful.
It is. And I think it's really where we find this difficult road, the narrow road, the not popular road, where we find the true attractiveness. It's not because of the road itself, but because of who we find on it. I think that's one, Jesus, and two, the community that is making that same choice that hopefully we are, and that is to follow him.
I like that. Well, thanks again for being with us and being part of this discussion as we're having it. And we'd like to continue that conversation. So we've put some show notes together with some questions for reflection. So if you have time to pop those open and have a look and see what the questions are, maybe take a few minutes to reflect on those at maybe a bit later time. It's always helpful to do that with somebody. And if you're part of our missional communities that are part of our church community, we encourage you to get together and to next time you meet and look at those questions together and just kind of mull over and just figure out what it means for you, how you might live these kinds of things out. And that's always, again, we're trying, as we said, not to just be have a faith that we confess, but a faith that we actually do. So I hope you find these podcasts helpful, and it helps us a lot if you could just hit the like and subscribe button, and we hope you'll join us for our next video.